As of 2023, the total debt of Africa stood at approximately $1.8 trillion. Surprisingly, this amount, although significant, is comparatively lower than the debt levels of any other global region. It may astonish you to learn that Germany, a European country, carries a debt burden of around $2.9 trillion, surpassing the combined debts of all African nations. However, the challenge lies in the fact that African countries face the burden of debt, which exerts considerable pressure on their economies, primarily due to the majority of the debt being owed to international lenders rather than domestic ones. In contrast, developed countries like Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom tend to borrow from domestic creditors. The key distinction lies in the fact that external lenders prefer to extend loans to developing countries in their own currency or international hard currencies, such as the dollar, whereas domestic lenders provide loans in the country's local currency. Presently, more than 30% of Africa's total debt is owed to development organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. These institutions typically attach certain conditions to their loans, which African countries must fulfill. Reports indicate that the loans from the IMF, along with the associated conditions, have significantly contributed to the economic challenges faced by many African nations. This is why Thomas Sankara, in his critique of debt, referred to debt as neocolonialism, wherein former colonizers transform themselves into providers of technical assistance. During his presidency in Burkina Faso, Sankara actively rejected loans and assistance from the IMF and the World Bank. He even attempted to persuade other African countries to collectively refuse payment of their financial debts to their former colonizers. This was an effort to challenge the current form of debt, which he believed was skillfully managed reconquest by imperialism over Africa. Inspired by the ideals of Thomas Sankara, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso has embarked on a similar path. Recent reports reveal that Traore has made the remarkable decision to decline financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, demonstrating his unwavering commitment to safeguarding his country's long-term interests. For decades, African nations have relied on loans from the World Bank and IMF to undertake various development projects. However, these loans often come with strict conditions, such as reducing government expenditure on social infrastructure, which ultimately have adverse effects on the citizens of the country. Similar to Thomas Sankara, Ibrahim Traore believes that the IMF and World Bank act as agents of economic oppression, perpetuating countries in a cycle of debt through their structured operations. It is widely recognized that once a country becomes indebted to these institutions, breaking free from the burden becomes exceedingly challenging. The economic policies imposed by these loans often harm the economy instead of improving it. Traore firmly believes that countries indebted to these organizations will never achieve true economic independence. His bold decision to reject their assistance underscores his dedication to prioritizing the well-being of his people above all else. In addition to economic interference, accepting loans and aid from the IMF and World Bank opens the door for these Western-led organizations to meddle in the political affairs of African countries. This interference has created a group of African puppets who serve the interests of the West. However, Traore has been resolute in his opposition to Western intervention in African matters and has made it clear that he will not tolerate any form of external interference in his country. Hence, it comes as no surprise that President Traore's decision aligns with the recent speech delivered by the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso on national television. The Prime Minister addressed a specific topic titled, "No one violates freedom of expression as much as Westerners." During his comprehensive 30-minute speech, the Prime Minister highlighted several noteworthy points. Firstly, he emphasized the notion that it is preferable to be impoverished in a prosperous and robust state rather than being wealthy in a weak state. He expressed his belief that the current state of poverty in Africa is partly attributed to attempts to undermine African leaders and destabilize regimes. According to the Prime Minister, a strong state serves as a guarantee of security, stability, and institutional development. He acknowledged that had Thomas Sankara's revolution endured, Burkina Faso could have been propelled onto the path of rapid development within a decade. However, in order to establish a robust state, the government must navigate the snares crafted by dominators to weaken African nations and make them pliable. The Prime Minister identified three specific traps that warrant analysis: the so-called insistence on human rights, the so-called respect for freedom of speech, and the neocolonial institutions prevalent in modern African states. Furthermore, the Prime Minister highlighted that if it were not for the knowledge of human rights in Africa, Europeans would not have arrived to encounter kingdoms and societies with remarkable civilizations and post-colonial African art. These artistic creations captivated Europeans to such an extent that they resorted to stealing these works of art to fill their museums and aristocratic salons. In the absence of a well-structured social organization that respected the rights of every social category within African societies, the achievements they made would not have been possible. However, the Prime Minister expressed that in contemporary times, human rights have become a tool for controlling third world societies in service of the West. These rights provide the West with the assurance that their local values, some of which are directly funded by Western sources and others indirectly through distorted procedures, will be given the freedom to operate. This allows them to infiltrate state affairs and weaken the government to their advantage. To support his argument, the Prime Minister cited examples of countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Iran. These nations have successfully resisted various attempts at destabilization due to their strong state structures and the visionary policies of their leaders. Furthermore, the Prime Minister provided an in-depth perspective on the state of fundamental rights and human rights in Burkina Faso in comparison to the West. He emphasized that in Burkina Faso, fundamental rights are yet to be adequately addressed. He highlighted essential aspects of human rights, such as access to food, healthcare, education, and adequate housing for all citizens. The Prime Minister criticized the Western nations, pointing out that these basic rights are not always fulfilled in their own countries. He further criticized the discrepancy in how human rights violations are treated. While violations in the West are often overlooked or handled through measures to maintain order, similar violations in other regions face severe condemnation. This double standard on the part of the West is evident, and numerous examples highlight this disparity. The Prime Minister provided a striking example to support his argument, focusing on the United States, where individuals perceived as threats to national security are eliminated without undergoing due process. Surprisingly, these blatant acts of human rights violations receive little to no international scrutiny. Further, the Prime Minister highlighted historical and recent instances of foreign interventions by global powers, such as the United States and France in various countries. These interventions often prove detrimental to the local populations. Specifically, he mentioned France's involvement in coups across Francophone Africa and its support for terrorism in the Sahel region. These actions have resulted in thousands of deaths and continue to pose ongoing challenges for affected communities. Moreover, the Prime Minister drew attention to domestic unrest and government actions within France itself. He cited the Yellow Vest protests in 2018 and the controversial death of Jean Nahel in 2023 as examples that triggered significant social upheaval. Reports indicate excessive use of force and even instances of torture to suppress protests, indicating a lack of accountability for human rights violations within France. Despite these evident accounts of gross human rights violations from Western nations, the Prime Minister noted the conspicuous silence of international bodies and media regarding these issues. This script highlights concerns about the selective focus on human rights, driven by geopolitical interests and a lack of addressing the broader implications of these issues. It emphasizes the necessity for a consistent and universal approach to upholding human rights principles worldwide. The Prime Minister called for greater accountability from all nations, regardless of their geopolitical significance. He stressed the importance of promoting ethical governance and respecting the fundamental rights of individuals. Regarding freedom of expression, the Prime Minister pointed out instances where Western countries, including France, expelled Russian press organizations from their territories in the wake of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. He highlighted incidents where an activist lost their French nationality for expressing their views, and a local French elected official was suspended for merely observing Russian presidential scrutiny. These actions clearly constitute human rights violations. However, France did not face condemnation, and the news received limited coverage from the media. In contrast, when Burkina Faso suspended BBC and VOA media, all Western media houses extensively covered the news, criticizing the military government for violating freedom of speech. The Prime Minister questioned whether the West genuinely defends freedom of speech or if their ideological, political, and economic interests take precedence. He suggested that the emphasis on freedom of speech and human rights by the West is often used as a means to further their interests in other countries.